Hello, everybody. How are you doing today? It is a beautiful Sunday. I'm going to adjust the camera. I'm so sorry. There we go. That's a little better. Some of you might have noticed, if you've been watching through this Pride and Prejudice in the series, that I am in another new spot in my house. It's a spot, apartment. It's a spot that I've been in before, but I stopped because I was trying to do into the bedroom so I wouldn't have to be in the main room. We have a main room and then 2 bedrooms. And, I can't be in the bedroom. Well, I mean, I suppose I could, but the gaming, like the nice chair that I have, that's not my beautiful, lovely, perfect rocking chair, is really awful to get through the little doorway. And I have to jury rig it, and it's really annoying, and usually my husband can do it, but he's not here right now, and I literally couldn't get the chair through the door, and I decided, you know what, screw it, no one's here, I'm gonna be doing it here. And I have a new painting. I get to show off my paintings as well, which is fun, so I think this is just gonna be my spot. Experimenting is fun, but this is gonna be my spot for now until ever, I guess. So let's see, other news. It's been cold today. It's been cold the past couple of days, to the point where I've had to wear a jacket. But amazingly enough, I hung out with someone today. Oh, well, not today. Oh, thank you, Amanda. I'm glad you like it. It went through a couple of developments, but I think it's one of the most realistic looking squids, realistic looking animals that I painted to date. So we'll see. I'm working on one for July, but I have to figure out how to paint a tree, and that's more difficult than, because the bark and it has to look right, and I could do it. I'm just delaying, and I haven't painted in a while, so I'll paint some more. I will. But why don't we go through a little bit of a synopsis, because some stuff happened in the last few chapters. Darcy and Elizabeth got to know each other a little bit better. However, their reunion was interrupted by some disturbing knowledge from Longbourn. Lydia had gone off to Brighton to as the particular friend of Mrs. Foster, the wife of the colonel of the regiment, and she ran away with Wickham. Now, in today's sort of modern era, we might not feel the societal horror as much, like the intense badness of what Lydia has just done by running away, claiming to be eloped, but not actually not getting married at all, just an unmarried woman hanging out with a man. At the moment, in our day and age, it's not too scandalous. The best representation I've seen of that, and it's actually my second favorite iteration of Pride and Prejudice in all modern culture, is the Lizzie Bennet diaries. It's on YouTube. It's absolutely amazing. If you have not watched it, I highly, highly recommend it. I love it so much that I got the extra book, The Secret Diary of Lizzie Bennet. It's amazing. So good. But in that iteration of it, the scandal between Lydia and Wickham is actually Wickham is going to put basically a porn video of her up. Sorry, I know small ones might be watching. Oh goodness, Amanda, I would love any tips you have about trees. Please send them over to me on Discord, because I need help. Anyway, so he was going to publicly release a video, a sex video that he had taken between him and Lydia. And that's kind of the equivalent horror of what we're looking at. The fact that she ran away without her parents' permission, the fact that she's not getting married, the fact that she has spent at least 2 days unsupervised in a man's company. It's all things that will ostracize not only her from society, but her family as well. They will be tainted if they do not get this figured out. It is, and it's not just society. It's also Lydia is herself in danger. She's 16 years old, hanging out with a man well beyond her age, who she has no knowledge of the world. She has no great sense, no great sense of self-preservation. All she cares about is adventure and idle pleasures. She can be taken advantage of. She could be left for dead. Anything could happen to her, and nobody would ever figure it out. So this is a very scary, intense time for the Bennet family. So with that being said, let me take a sip of my tea. It's iced tea because it's a little warm. A little too warm for hot tea, but oh, it's so good. I do homemade iced tea, none of those brews. I brew it all myself because it's just better that way. All right. Chapter 47. Yes, Lydia is a very, sorry, I just saw the comment. That's a very good, Ariel from Little Mermaid is a very good, what am I thinking? Simile, metaphor, comparison. It's excellent. That's quite right. So, chapter 47. I've been thinking it over again, Elizabeth, said her uncle as they drove from the town, and really, upon serious consideration, I am much more inclined than I was to judge as your eldest sister does the matter. It appears to me so very unlikely that any young man should form such a design against a girl who is by no means unprotected or friendless, and who is actually staying in his colonel's family, that I am strongly inclined to hope for the best. Could he expect that her friends would not step forward? Could he expect to be noticed again by the regiment after such an affront to Colonel Foster? His temptation is not adequate to the risk. Do you really think so? Cried Elizabeth, brightening up for a moment. Upon my word, said Mrs. Gardiner, I begin to be of your uncle's opinion. It is really too great a violation of decency, honor, and interest for him to be guilty of it. I cannot think so very ill of Wickham. Can you, yourself, Lizzie, so wholly give him up as to believe him capable of it? Not perhaps of neglecting his own interest, but of every other neglect I can believe him capable, if indeed it should be so, but I dare not hope it. Why should they not go on to Scotland if that had been the case? In the first place, replied Mr. Gardiner, there is absolutely no proof that they are not gone to Scotland. Oh, but their removing from the chaise into a hackney coach is such a presumption, and besides, no traces of them were to be found on the Barnet road. Well, then, supposing them to be in London, they may be there, though for the purpose of concealment, for no more exceptionable purpose. It is not likely that money should be very abundant on either side, and it might strike them that they could be more economically, though less expeditiously, married in London than in Scotland. But why all this secrecy? Why any fear of detection? Why must their marriage be private? Oh, no, this is not likely. His most particular friend, you see by Jane's account, was persuaded of his never intending to marry her. Wickham will never marry a woman without some money. He cannot afford it. And what claims has Lydia? What attractions has she beyond youth, health, and good humor that could make him, for her sake, forego every chance of benefiting himself by marrying well? As to what restraint the apprehension of disgrace in the corps might throw on a dishonorable elopement with her, I am not able to judge, for I know nothing of the effects that such a step might produce. But as to your other objection, I am afraid it will hardly hold good. Lydia has no brothers to step forward, and he might imagine, from my father's behavior, from his indolence and the little attention he has ever seemed to give to what was going forward in his family, that he would do as little and think as little about it as any father could do in such a matter. But can you think that Lydia is so lost to everything but love of him as to consent to live with him on any other terms than marriage? It does seem, and it is most shocking indeed, replied Elizabeth, with tears in her eyes, that a sister's sense of decency and virtue should in such a point admit a doubt. But really, I know not what to say. Perhaps I am not doing her justice, but she is very young. She has never been taught to think on serious subjects, and for the last half-year, nay, for a 12-month, she has been given up to nothing but amusement and vanity. She has been allowed to dispose of her time in the most idle and frivolous manner, and to adopt any opinions that came in her way. Since the Shire were first quartered in Meryton, nothing but love, flirtation, and officers have been in her head. She has been doing everything in her power by thinking and talking on the subject to give greater, what shall I call it, susceptibility to her feelings, which are naturally lively enough. And we all know that Wickham has every charm of person and address that can captivate a woman. But you see that Jane, said her aunt, does not think so ill of Wickham as to believe him capable of the attempt. Of whom does Jane ever think ill? And who is there, whatever might be their former conduct, that she would believe capable of such an attempt, till it were proved against them? But Jane knows, as well as I do, what Wickham really is. We both know that he has been profligate in every sense of the word, that he has neither integrity nor honor, that he is as false and deceitful as he is insinuating. And do you really know all this? Cried Mrs. Gardiner, whose curiosity as to the mode of her intelligence was all alive. I do indeed, replied Elizabeth, colouring. I told you the other day of his infamous behaviour to Mr. Darcy, and you yourself, when last at Longbourn, heard in what manner he spoke of the man who had behaved with such forbearance and liberality towards him. And there are other circumstances which I am not at liberty, which is not worthwhile to relate, but his lies about the whole Pemberley family are endless. From what he said of Miss Darcy, I was thoroughly prepared to see a proud, reserved, disagreeable girl, yet he knew to the contrary himself. He must know that she was as amiable and unpretending as we have found her. But does Lydia know nothing of this? Can she be ignorant of what you and Jane seem to understand so well? Oh, yes, that is the worst of it all. Till I was in Kent and saw so much of Mr. Darcy and his relation, Colonel Fitzwilliam, I was ignorant of the truth myself. And when I returned home, the Shire was to leave Meryton in a week or fortnight's time. As that was the case, neither Jane, to whom I related the whole, nor I thought it necessary to make our knowledge public. For of what use could it apparently be to anyone that the good opinion which all the neighbourhood had of him should be overthrown? And even when it was settled that Lydia should go with Mrs. Foster, the necessity of opening her eyes to his character never occurred to me. That she could be in any danger from the deception never entered my head. That such a consequence as this should ensue, you may easily believe, was far from my thoughts. When they all removed to Brighton, therefore, you had no reason, I suppose, to believe them fond of each other? Not the slightest. I can remember no symptom of affection on either side, and had anything of the kind been perceptible, you must be aware that ours is not a family on which it could be thrown away. When he first entered the corps, she was ready enough to admire him, but so were we all. Every girl in or near Meryton was out of her senses about him for the first 2 months, but he never distinguished her by any particular attention, and consequently, after a moderate period of extravagant and wild admiration, her fancy for him gave way, and others of the regiment, who treated her with more distinction, again became her favourites. It may be easily believed that, however little of novelty could be added to their fears, hopes, and conjectures on this interesting subject by its repeated discussion, no other could detain them from it long during the whole of their journey. From Elizabeth's thoughts it was never absent. Fixed there by the keenest of all anguish, self-reproach, she could find no interval of ease or forgetfulness. They travelled as expeditiously as possible, and sleeping one night on the road, reached Longbourn by dinner-time the next day. It was a comfort to Elizabeth to consider that Jane could not have been wearied by long expectations. The little Gardiners, attracted by the sight of a chaise, were standing on the steps of the house as they entered the paddock when the carriage drove up. The joyful surprise that lighted up their faces and displayed itself all over their whole bodies in a variety of capers and frisks was the first pleasing earnest of their welcome. Elizabeth jumped out, and, after giving each of them a hasty kiss, hurried into the vestibule, where Jane, who came running downstairs from her mother's apartment, immediately met her. Elizabeth, as she most affectionately embraced her, whilst tears filled the eyes of both, lost not a moment in asking whether anything had been heard of the fugitives. Not yet, replied Jane, but now that my dear uncle has come, I hope everything will be well. Is my father in town? Yes, he went on Tuesday, as I wrote you word. And have you heard from him often? We have heard only once. He wrote me a few lines on Wednesday to say that he arrived in safety and to give me his directions, which I particularly begged him to do. He merely added that he should not write again till he had something of importance to mention. And my mother, how is she? How are you all? My mother is tolerably well, I trust, though her spirits are greatly shaken. She is upstairs, and will have great satisfaction in seeing you all. She does not yet leave her dressing-room. Mary and Kitty, thank heaven, are quite well. But you, how are you? Cried Elizabeth. You look pale. How much you must have gone through. Her sister, however, assured her of her being perfectly well, and their conversation, which had been passing while Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were engaged with their children, was now put to an end by the approach of the whole party. Jane ran to her uncle and aunt, and welcomed and thanked them both, with alternate smiles and tears. When they were all in the drawing-room, the questions which Elizabeth had already asked were of course repeated by the others, and they soon found that Jane had no intelligence to give. The sanguine hope of good, however, which the benevolence of her heart suggested, had not yet deserted her. She still expected that it would all end well, and that every morning would bring some letter, either from Lydia or her father, to explain their proceedings, and perhaps announce the marriage. Mrs. Bennet, to whose apartment they all repaired after a few minutes' conversation together, received them as exactly might be expected. With tears and lamentations of regret, invectives against the villainous conduct of Wickham, complaints of her own sufferings and ill usage, blaming everybody but the person whose ill-judging indulgence of the errors of her daughter must be principally owing. "If I had been able," said she, "to carry my point of going to Brighton with all my family, this would not have happened. But poor dear Lydia had nobody to take care of her. Or did the Fosters ever let her go out of their sight? I am sure there was some great neglect or other on their side, for she is not the kind of girl to do such a thing, if she had been well looked after. I always thought they were very unfit to have the charge of her, but I was overruled, as I always am. Poor dear child. And now here's Mr. Bennet gone away. I know he will fight Wickham wherever he meets him, and then he will be killed, and what is to become of us all? The Collinses will turn us out before he's cold in his grave. And if you are not kind to us, brother, I do not know what we shall do." They all exclaimed against such terrific ideas, and Mr. Gardiner, after general assurances of his affection for her and all her family, told her that he meant to be in London the very next day, and would assist Mr. Bennet in every endeavour for recovering Lydia. "Do not give way to useless alarm," added he, "though it is right to be prepared for the worst. There is no occasion to look on it as certain. It is not quite a week since they left Brighton. In a few days more we may gain some news of them, and till we know that they are not married and have no design of marrying, do not let us give the matter over as lost. As soon as I get to town, I shall go to my brother and make him come home with me to Gracechurch Street, and then we may consult us together what is to be done." "Oh, my dear brother," replied Mrs. Bennet, "that is exactly what I could most wish for. And now do, when you get to town, find them out, wherever they may be, and if they are not married already, make them marry. And as for wedding clothes, do not let them wait for that, but tell Apollo, I'm very sorry. I'm reading right now. Do you mind? Here. You are a very big fan with a certain 3-year-old, so I'll get you on camera again. Say hello, Apollo. Hello, Apollo. Okay. Goodbye, Apollo. I apologize. We had a little cat break. Let's see. Tell Lydia she shall have as much money as she chooses to buy them after they are married. And above all things, keep Mr. Bennet from fighting. Tell him what a dreadful state I am in, that I am frightened out of my wits, and I have such tremblings and flutterings all over me, such spasms in my side, and pains in my head, and beatings at my heart, that I can get no rest by night or day. And tell my dear Lydia not to give any directions about her clothes till she has seen me, for she does not know which of them is to wear houses. Oh, brother, how kind you are! I know you will contrive it all." But Mr. Gardiner, though he assured her again of his earnest endeavour in the cause, could not avoid recommending moderation to her, as well in her hopes as her fears, and after talking with her in this manner till dinner was on the table, they left her to vent all her feelings on the housekeeper, who attended in the absence of her daughters. Though her brother and sister were persuaded that there was no real occasion for such a seclusion from the family, they did not attempt to oppose it, for they knew that she had not prudence enough to hold her tongue before the servants, while they waited at table, and judged it better that one only of the household, and the one whom they could most trust, should comprehend all her fears and solicitude on the subject. In the dining-room they were soon joined by Mary and Kitty, who had been too busily engaged in their separate apartments to make their appearance before. One came from her books, and the other from her toilette. The faces of both, however, were tolerably calm. No change was visible in either, except that the loss of her favorite sister, or the anger which she had herself incurred in the business, had given something more of fretfulness than usual to the accents of Kitty. As for Mary, she was mistress enough of herself to whisper to Elizabeth with a countenance of grave reflection soon after they were seated at the table, "This is a most unfortunate affair, and will probably be much talked of, but we must stem the tide of malice, and pour into the wounded bosoms of each other the balm of sisterly consolation." Then, perceiving in Elizabeth no inclination of replying, she added, "Unhappy as the event must be for Lydia, we may draw from it this useful lesson. That loss of virtue in a female is irretrievable, that one false step involves her in endless ruin, that her reputation is no less brittle than it is beautiful, and that she cannot be too much guarded in her behavior towards the undeserving of the other sex." Elizabeth lifted up her eyes in amazement, but was too much opposed to make any reply. Mary, however, continued to console herself with such kind of moral extractions from the evil before them. Mary would have made a good match for Mr. Collins. In the afternoon, the two elder Miss Bennets were able to be for half an hour by themselves, and Elizabeth instantly availed herself of the opportunity of making many enquiries, which Jane was equally eager to satisfy. After joining in general lamentations over the dreadful sequel of this event, which Elizabeth considered as all but certain, Miss Bennet could not assert to be wholly impossible. The former continued the subject by saying, "But tell me all and everything about it, which I have not already heard. Give me farther particulars. What did Colonel Foster say? Had they no apprehension of anything before the elopement took place? They must have seen them together forever." Colonel Foster did own that he had often suspected some partiality, especially on Lydia's side, but nothing to give him any alarm. "I am so grieved for him. His behavior was attentive and kind to the utmost. He was coming to us in order to assure us of his concern before he had any idea of their not being gone to Scotland. When that apprehension first got abroad, it hastened his journey." "And was Denny convinced that Wickham would not marry? Did he know of their intending to go off? Had Colonel Foster seen Denny himself?" "Yes, but when questioned by him, Denny denied knowing anything of their plan, and would not give his real opinion about it. He did not repeat his persuasion of their not marrying, and from that I am inclined to hope he might have been misunderstood before. And till Colonel Foster came himself, not one of you entertained a doubt, I suppose, of their being really married." "How was it possible that such an idea should enter our brains? I felt a little uneasy, a little fearful of my sister's happiness with him in marriage, because I knew his conduct had not always been quite right. My mother and father knew nothing of that. They only felt how imprudent a match it must be. Kitty then owned, with a very natural triumph, on knowing more than the rest of us, that in Lydia's last letter she had prepared her for such a step. She had known, it seems, of their being in love with each other for many weeks." "But not before they went to Brighton?" "No, I believe not." "And did Colonel Foster appear to think ill of Wickham himself? Does he know his real character?" "I must confess that he did not speak so well of Wickham as he formerly did. He believed him to be imprudent and extravagant, and since this sad affair has taken place, it is said that he left Meryton greatly in debt. But I hope this may be false." "Oh, Jane, had we been less secret, had we told what we knew of him, this could not have happened." "Perhaps it would have been better," replied her sister, "but to expose the former faults of any person, without knowing what their present feelings were, seemed unjustifiable. We acted with the best intentions." "Could Colonel Foster repeat the particulars of Lydia's note to his wife?" "He brought it with him for us to see." Jane then took from her pocketbook and gave it to Elizabeth. These were the contents. "My dear Harriet, you will laugh when you know I am gone, and I cannot help laughing myself at your surprise tomorrow morning, as soon as I am missed. I am going to Gretna Green, and if you cannot guess with who, I shall think you a simpleton, for there is but one man in the world I love, so think it no harm to be off. You need not send them word at Longbourn of my going, if you do not like it, for it will make the surprise the greater when I write to them and sign my name Lydia Wickham. What a good joke it will be. I can hardly write for laughing. Pray make my excuses to Pratt for not keeping my engagement and dancing with him tonight. Tell him I hope he will excuse me when he knows all, and tell him I will dance with him at the next ball we meet, with great pleasure. I shall send for my clothes when I get to Longbourn, but I wish you would tell Sally to mend a great slit in my working muslin gown before they are packed up. Goodbye. Give my love to Colonel Foster. I hope you will drink to our good journey. Your affectionate friend, Lydia Bennet. Ooh, that's an excellent, sorry, I just saw your quotes, Amanda, and that's an excellent suggestion. I'll have more on that when I finish. I'll tell you more about my ideas. Oh, thoughtless Lydia, cried Elizabeth when she had finished it. What a letter is this, to be written at such a moment! But at least it shows that she was serious on the object of her journey. Whatever he might afterwards persuade her to do, it was not on her side a scheme of infamy. My poor father, how he must have felt it. I never saw anyone so shocked. He could not speak a word for a full 10 minutes. My mother was taken ill immediately, and the whole house in such a confusion. Oh, Jane, cried Elizabeth, was there a servant belonging to it who did not know the whole story before the end of day? I do not know. I hope there was. But to be guarded at such a time is very difficult. My mother was in hysterics, and though I endeavored to give her every assistance in my power, I'm afraid I did not do so much as I might have done. But the horror of what might possibly happen almost took me from my faculties. Your attendance upon her has been too much for you. You do not look well. Oh, that I had been with you. You've had every care and anxiety upon yourself alone. Mary and Kitty have been very kind, and would have shared in every fatigue, I am sure, but I did not think it right for either of them. Kitty is slight and delicate, and Mary studies so much that her hours of repose should not be broken in on. My Aunt Philip came to Longbourn on Tuesday, after my father went away, and was so good as to stay until Thursday with me. She was of great use and comfort to us all, and Lady Lucas has been very kind. She walked here on Wednesday morning to console with us and offer her services, or any of her daughters, if they could be of use to us. She'd better stayed at home, cried Elizabeth. Perhaps she meant well, but under such a misfortune as this, one cannot see too little of one's neighbors. Assistance is impossible, condolence insufferable. Let them triumph over us at a distance and be satisfied. She then proceeded to inquire into the measures which her father had intended to pursue while in town for the recovery of his daughter. He meant, I believe, replied Jane, to go to Epsom, the place where they last changed horses, see the positions, and try if anything could be made out from them. His principal object must be to discover the number of the hackney coach which took them from Clapham. It had come with a fare from London, and as he thought the circumstance of a gentleman and a lady removing from one carriage into another might be remarked, he meant to make enquiries at Clapham. If he could anyhow discover at what house the coachman had set down his fare, he determined to make enquiries there, and hoped it might not be impossible to find out the stand and number of the coach. I do not know of any other designs he had formed, but he was in such a hurry to be gone, and his spirits so greatly discomposed, that I had difficulty in finding out even so much as this. Chapter 48. The whole party were in hopes of a letter from Mr. Bennet the next morning, but the post came in without bringing a single line from him. His family knew him to be on all common occasions a most negligent and dilatory correspondent, but at such a time they had hoped for exertion. They were forced to conclude that he had no pleasing intelligence to send, but even of that they would have been glad to be certain. Mr. Gardiner had waited only for the letters before he set off. When he was gone, they were certain of at least receiving constant information of what was going on, and their uncle promised, at parting, to prevail on Mr. Bennet to return to Longbourn as soon as he could, to the great consolation of his sister, who considered it as the only security for her husband's not being killed in a duel. Mrs. Gardiner and the children to remain in Hertfordshire a few days longer, as the former thought her presence might be serviceable to her nieces. She shared in their attendance on Mrs. Bennet, and was a great comfort to them in their hours of freedom. Their other aunt also visited them frequently, and always, as she said, with the design of cheering and heartening them up, though as she never came without reporting some fresh instance of Wickham's extravagance or irregularity, she seldom went away without leaving them more dispirited than she found them. All Meryton seemed striving to blacken the man who, but 3 months before, had been almost an angel of light. He was declared to be in debt to every tradesman in the place, and his intrigues, all honoured with the title of seduction, had been extended into every tradesman's family. Everybody declared that he was the wickedest young man in the world, and everybody began to find out that they had always distrusted the appearance of his goodness. Elizabeth, though she did not credit above half of what was said, believed enough to make her former assurance of her sister's ruin still more certain, and even Jane, who believed still less of it, became almost hopeless, more especially as the time was now come when if they had gone to Scotland, which she had never before entirely despaired of, they must in all probability have gained some news of them. Mr. Gardiner left Longbourn on Sunday. On Tuesday, his wife received a letter from him. It told them that on his arrival he had immediately found out his brother, and persuaded him to come to Gracechurch Street. That Mr. Bennet had been to Epsom and Clapham before his arrival, but without gaining any satisfactory information, and that he was now determined to inquire at all the principal hotels in town, as Mr. Bennet thought it possible they might have gone to one of them on their first coming to London before they procured lodgings. Mr. Gardiner himself did not expect any success from this measure, but as his brother was eager in it, he meant to insist him in pursuing it. He added that Mr. Bennet seemed wholly disinclined at present to leave London, and promised to write again very soon. There was also a postscript to this effect. I have written to Colonel Foster to desire him to find out, if possible, from some of the young man's intimates in the regiment, whether Wickham has any relations or connections who would be likely to know in what part of the town he has now concealed himself. If there were anyone that one could apply to, with a probability of gaining such a clue as that, it might be of essential consequence. At present we have nothing to guide us. Colonel Foster will, I dare say, do everything in his power to satisfy us on this head, but on second thoughts, perhaps Lizzie could tell us what relations he has now living better than any other person. Elizabeth was at no loss to understand from whence this deference for her authority proceeded, but it was not in her power to give information of so satisfactory a nature as the compliment deserved. She had never heard of his having any relations, except a father and a mother, both of whom had been dead many years. It was possible, however, that some of his companions in the shire might be able to give more information, though she was not very sanguine in expecting the application was something to look forward to. Every day at Longbourn was now a day of anxiety, but the anxious part of each was when the post was expected. The arrival of letters was the first grand object of every morning's impatience. Through letters, whether of good or bad was to be told, Through letters, whatever of good or bad was to be told would be communicated, and every succeeding day was expected to bring some news of importance. But before they had heard again from Mr. Gardiner, a letter arrived for their father from a different quarter, from Mr. Collins, which, as Jane had received directions to open all that came for him in his absence, she accordingly read, and Elizabeth, who knew what curiosities his letters always were, looked over her and read it likewise. It was as follows. My dear sir, I feel myself called upon by our relationship and my situation in life to condole with you on the grievous affliction you are now suffering under, of which we were yesterday informed by a letter from Hertfordshire. Be assured, my dear sir, that Mrs. Collins and myself sincerely sympathize with you and all your respectable family in your present distress, which must be of the bitterest kind, because proceeding from a cause which no time can remove. No argument shall be wanting on my part that can alleviate so severe a misfortune, or that may comfort you under a circumstance that must be of all others most afflicting to a parent's mind. The death of your daughter would have been a blessing in comparison of this. And it is the more to be lamented, because there is reason to suppose, as my dear Charlotte informs me, that this licentiousness of behavior in your daughter has proceeded from a faulty degree of indulgence, though at the same time, for the consolation of yourself and Mrs. Bennet, I am inclined to think that her own disposition must be naturally bad, or she could not be guilty of such an enormity at so early an age. However that may be, you are grievously to be pitied, in which opinion I am not only joined by Mrs. Collins, but likewise by Lady Catherine and her daughter, to whom I have related the affair. They agree with me in apprehending that this false step in one daughter will be injurious to the fortunes of all the others, for who, as Lady Catherine herself condescendingly says, will connect themselves with such a family. And this consideration leads me moreover to reflect with augmented satisfaction on a certain event of last November, for had it been otherwise, I must have been involved in all your sorrow and disgrace. Let me advise you then, my dear sir, to console yourself as much as possible, to throw off your unworthy child from your affections forever, and to leave her to reap the fruits of her own heinous offense. I am, dear sir, etc., etc. What a bad, stupid... I despise Mr. Collins. Ooh, I don't like him at all. Oh, blah, blah, blah. You know what? I need to take a sip of tea, because that was just gross to read. Gross. Mr. Gardner did not write again till he had received an answer from Colonel Foster, and then he had nothing of a pleasant nature to send. It was not known that Wickham had a single relation with whom he kept up any connection, and it was certain that he had no near one living. His former acquaintance had been numerous, but since he had been in the militia, it did not appear that he was on terms of particular friendship with any of them. There was no one, therefore, who could be pointed out as likely to give any news of him, and in the wretched state of his own finances, there was a very powerful motive for secrecy, in addition to his fear of discovery by Lydia's relations, for it has just transpired that he had left gaming debts behind him to a very considerable amount. Colonel Foster believed that more than £1,000 would be necessary to clear his expenses at Brighton. He owed a good deal in town, but his debts of honor were still more formidable. Mr. Gardner did not attempt to conceal these particulars from the Longbourn family. Jane heard them with horror. "A gamester!" she cried. "This is wholly unexpected. I had not an idea of it." Mr. Gardner added in his letter that they might expect to see their father at home on the following day, which was Saturday. Rendered spiritless by the ill success of all their endeavors, he had yielded to his brother-in-law's entreaty that he would return to his family, and leave him to do whatever occasion might suggest to be advisable for the continuing their pursuit. When Mrs. Bennet was told of this, she did not express so much satisfaction as her children expected, considering what her anxiety for his life had been before. "What? He is coming home without poor Lydia?" she cried. "Sure he will not leave London before he has found them. Who is to fight Wickham and make him marry her if he comes away?" As Mrs. Gardner began to wish to be at home, it was settled that she and her children should go to London at the same time that Mr. Bennet came from it. The coach, therefore, took them the first stage of their journey, and brought its master back to Longbourn. Mrs. Gardner went away in all the perplexity about Elizabeth and her Derbyshire friend that had attended her from that part of the world. His name had never been voluntarily mentioned before them by her niece, and the kind of half-expectation which Mrs. Gardner had formed of their being followed by a letter from him had ended in nothing. Elizabeth had received none since her return that could come from Pemberley. The present state of the family rendered any other excuse for the lowness of her spirits unnecessary. Nothing, therefore, could be conjectured from that, though Elizabeth, who was by this time tolerably well acquainted with her own feelings, was perfectly aware that, had she known nothing of Darcy, she could have borne the dread of Lydia's infamy somewhat better. It would have spared her, she thought, one sleepless night out of 2. When Mr. Bennet arrived, he had all the appearance of his usual philosophic composure. He said as little as he had ever been in the habit of saying, made no mention of the business that had taken him away, and it was some time before his daughters had the courage to speak of it. It was not till the afternoon, when he joined them at tea, that Elizabeth ventured to introduce the subject, and then, on her briefly expressing her sorrow for what he must have endured, he replied, "Say nothing of that. Who should suffer but myself? It has been my own doing, and I ought to feel it." You must not be too severe on yourself, replied Elizabeth. You may well warn me against such an evil. Human nature is so prone to fall into it. No, Lizzie, let me once in my life feel how much I have been to blame. I am not afraid of being overpowered by the impression. It will pass away soon enough. Do you suppose them then to be in London? Yes, where else can they be so well concealed? And Lydia used to want to go to London, added Kitty. She is happy, then, her father said dryly, and her residence will probably be of some duration. After a short silence, he continued, Lizzie, I bear you no ill will for being justified in your advice to me last May, which, considering the event, shows some greatness of mind. They were interrupted by Miss Bennet, who came to fetch her mother's tea. This is a parade, cried he, which does one good. It gives such an elegance to misfortune. Another day I will do the same. I will sit in my library in my nightcap and powdering gown and give as much trouble as I can. Or perhaps I may defer it till Kitty runs away. I'm not going to run away, Papa, said Kitty fretfully. If I should ever go to Brighton, I would behave better than Lydia. You go to Brighton? I would not trust you so near it as Eastbourne, not for £50. No, Kitty, I have at last to learn to be cautious, and you will feel the effects of it. No officer is ever to enter my house again, nor even to pass through the village. Balls will be absolutely prohibited unless you stand up with one of your sisters, and you are never to stir out of doors till you can prove that you have spent 10 minutes of every day in a rational manner. Kitty, who took all these threats in a serious light, began to cry. Well, well, he said, do not make yourself unhappy. If you are a good girl for the next 10 years, I will take you to a review at the end of them. Ha, 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 Mr. Bennet. Let's see. All right, this last one is a quick one, and it's the end of the saga, so we'll do that really quickly. Chapter 49. 2 days after Mr. Bennet's return, as Jane and Elizabeth were walking together in the shrubbery behind the house, they saw the housekeeper coming towards them, and, concluding that she came to call them to her mother, went forward to meet her. But instead of the expected summons, when they approached her, she said to Miss Bennet, I beg your pardon, madam, for interrupting you, but I was in hopes that you might have got some good news from town, so I took the liberty of coming to ask. What do you mean, Hill? We have heard nothing from town. Dear madam, cried Mrs. Hill in great astonishment, don't you know that there is an express come from master from Mr. Gardiner? He's been there this half an hour, and master has had a letter. Away ran the girls, too eager to get in to have time for speech. They ran through the vestibule into the breakfast room, from thence to the library. Their father was in neither, and they were on the point of seeking him upstairs with their mother, when they were met by the butler, who said, If you're looking for my master, ma'am, he's walking towards the little copse. Upon this information, they instantly passed through the hall once more and ran across the lawn after their father, who was deliberately pursuing his way towards a small wood on one side of the paddock. Jane, who was not so light nor so much in the habit of running as Elizabeth, soon lagged behind, and while her sister, panting for breath, came up with him, eagerly cried out, Oh, Papa, what's news? What news? Have you heard from my uncle? Yes, I have had a letter from him by express. Well, and what news does it bring, good or bad? What is there of good to be expected? Said he, taking the letter from his pocket. But perhaps you would like to read it. Elizabeth impatiently caught it from his hand. Jane now came up. Read it aloud, said their father, for I hardly know myself what it is about. And the letter is thus. My dear brother, at last I am able to send you some tidings of my niece, and as such, upon the whole, I hope will give you satisfaction. Soon after you left me on Saturday, I was fortunate enough to find out in what part of London they were. The particulars I reserve till we meet. It is enough to know they are discovered. I have seen them both. Then it is as I always hoped, cried Jane. They are married. Elizabeth read on. I have seen them both. They are not married, nor can I find there was any intention of being so. But if you are willing to perform the engagements which I have ventured to make on your side, I hope it will not be long before they are. All that is required of you is to assure your daughter by settlement her equal share of the £5,000 secured among your children after the decease of yourself and my sister, and moreover to enter into an engagement of allowing her, during your life, £100 per annum. These are conditions which, considering everything, I had no hesitation in complying with, as far as I thought myself privileged for you. I shall send this by express, that no time may be lost in bringing me your answer. You will easily comprehend from these particulars that Mr. Wickham's circumstances are not so hopeless as they are generally believed to be. The world has been deceived in that respect, and I am happy to say there will be some little money, even when all his debts are discharged, to settle on my niece, in addition to her own fortune. If, as I conclude will be the case, you send me full powers to act in your name throughout the whole of this business, I will immediately give directions to Haggerston for preparing a proper settlement. There will not be the smallest occasion for your coming to town again. Therefore, stay quietly in Longbourn, and depend on my diligence and care. Send back your answer as soon as you can, and be careful to write explicitly. We have judged it best that my niece should be married from this house, which I hope you will approve. She comes to us today. I shall write again as soon as anything more is determined. Yours, etc., Edward Gardiner. Is it possible, cried Elizabeth when she had finished, can it be possible that he will marry her? Wickham is not so undeserving, then, as we have thought, said her sister. My dear father, I congratulate you. You know what? Good comment. It's more... They are less worried about Wickham, they are basically worried about her character. But the fact that Lydia has lived with him for nearly a week or so now without being married, they have to get married or they will risk being erased from the high society and privilege that they have been in. So that's where they're coming from. Yeah. Have you answered the letter? Said Elizabeth. No, but it must be done soon. Most earnestly did she then entreat him to lose no more time before he wrote. Oh, my dear father, she cried, come back and write immediately. Consider how important every moment is in such a case. Let me write for you, said Jane, if you dislike the trouble yourself. I dislike it very much, he replied, but it must be done. And may I ask, said Elizabeth, but the terms, I suppose, must be complied with. Complied with? I am only ashamed of his asking so little. And they must marry. Yet he is such a man. Yes, they must marry. There is nothing else to be done. But there are two things that I want very much to know. One, how much money your uncle has laid down to bring it about. And the other, how am I ever to pay him? Money? My uncle? Cried Jane. What do you mean, sir? I mean that no man in his senses would marry Lydia on so slight a temptation as 100 a year during my life and 50 after I am gone. That is very true, said Elizabeth, though it had not occurred to me before. His debts to be discharged and something still to remain. Oh, it must be my uncle's doing. Generous, good man, I'm afraid he has distressed himself. A small sum would not do all this. No, said her father. Wickham's a fool if he takes her with a farthing less than £10,000. I should be sorry to think so ill of him in the very beginning of our relationship. £10,000! Heaven forbid! How is half such a sum to be repaid? Mr. Bennet made no answer, and each of them, deep in thought, continued silent till they reached the house. Their father then went to the library to write, and the girls walked into the breakfast room. And they are really to be married, cried Elizabeth, as soon as they were by themselves. How strange this is! And for this we are to be thankful, that they should marry, small as is their chance for happiness, and wretched as his character, we are forced to rejoice. Oh, Lydia! I comfort myself with thinking, replied Jane, that he certainly would not marry Lydia if he had not a real regard for her. Though our kind uncle has done something towards clearing him, I cannot believe that £10,000 or anything like it has been advanced. He has children of his own and may have more. How could he spare half £10,000? If we are ever able to learn what Wickham's debts have been, said Elizabeth, and how much is settled on his side on our sister, we shall exactly know what Mr. Gardiner has done for them, because Wickham has not a sixpence of his own. The kindness of my uncle and aunt can never be requited. Their taking her home and affording her their personal protection and countenance is such a sacrifice to her advantage as years of gratitude cannot acknowledge. By this time, she's actually with them. If such goodness does not make her miserable now, she will never deserve to be happy. What a meeting for her when she first sees my aunt. We must endeavor to forget all that has passed on either side, said Jane, and hope and trust they will yet be happy. His consenting to marry her is a proof, I will believe, that he has come to a right way of thinking. Their mutual affection will steady them, and I flatter myself they will settle so quietly and live in so rational a manner as may in time make their past imprudence forgotten. Their conduct has been such, replied Elizabeth, as neither you, nor I, nor anybody can ever forget. It is useless to talk of it. It now occurred to the girls that their mother was in all likelihood perfectly ignorant of what had happened to. They went to the library, therefore, and asked their father whether he would not wish them to make it known to her. He was, and without raising his head, coolly replied, just as you wish. May we take my uncle's letter to read her? Take whatever you like and get away. Elizabeth took the letter from his writing table, and they went upstairs together. Mary and Kitty were both with Mrs. Bennet. One communication would, therefore, do for all. After a slight preparation for good news, the letter was read out loud. Mrs. Bennet could hardly contain herself. As soon as Jane had read Mr. Gardiner's hopes of Lydia's being married soon, her joy burst forth, and every following sentence added to its exuberance. She was now in an irritation as violent from delight as she had ever been fidgety from alarm and vexation. She was disturbed by no fear for her felicity, nor humbled by... To know that her daughter would be married was enough. She was disturbed by no fear for her felicity, nor humbled by any remembrance for her misconduct. My dear, dear Lydia, she cried, this is delightful indeed. She will be married. I shall see her again. She will be married at 16. My good, kind brother. I knew how it would be. I knew he would manage everything. How I long to see her, and to see dear Wickham too. But the wedding clothes. Lizzie, my dear, run down to your father and ask him how much he will give her. Stay, I will go myself. Ring the bell, Kitty, for Hill. I will put on my things in a moment. My dear, dear Lydia, how merry we shall be together when we meet. Her eldest daughter endeavored to give some relief to the violence of these transports by leading her thoughts to the obligations which Mr. Gardiner's behavior laid them all under. For we must attribute this happy conclusion, she added, in a great measure to his kindness. We are persuaded that he has pledged himself to assist Mr. Wickham with money. Well, cried her mother, it is all very right. Who should do it but her own uncle? If he had not a family of his own, and I and my children must have had all his money, you know, and it is the first time we've ever had anything from him except a few presents. Well, I am happy. In a short time I shall have a daughter married. Mrs. Wickham, how well that sounds. And she was only 16 last June. My dear Jane, I am such a flutter that I am sure I can't write, so I will dictate, and you write for me. We will settle with your father about money afterwards, but the things should be ordered immediately. She was then proceeding to all the particulars of calico, muslin, and cambric, and would shortly have dictated some very plentiful orders, had not Jane, though with some difficulty, persuaded her to wait till her father was at leisure to be consulted. One day's delay, she observed, would be of small importance, and her mother was too happy to be quite so obstinate as usual. Other schemes soon came into her head. I will go to Meryton, said she, as soon as I am dressed, and tell the good news to my sister Phillips. And as I come back, I can call on Lady Lucas and Mrs. Long. Kitty, run down and order the carriage. An airing would do me a great deal of good, I am sure. Girls, can I do anything for you in Meryton? Oh, here comes Hill, my dear Hill. Have you heard the good news? Miss Lydia is going to be married, and you shall all have a bowl of punch to make merry at her wedding. Mrs. Hill instantly began to express her joy. Elizabeth received her congratulations amongst the rest, and then, sick of this folly, took her refuge in her own room, that she might think with freedom. Poor Lydia's situation must, at best, be bad enough, but that it was no worse she had need to be thankful. She felt it so, and though, looking forward, neither rational happiness nor worldly prosperity could be justly expected for her sister, and looking back to what they had feared only 2 hours ago, she felt all the advantages of what they had gained. So, just really quickly to address your concern there, like they would not have married the daughter. Elizabeth, and they're not insensible that Lydia has basically set herself up for a most unhappy life, a most unhappy marriage. But if she is to have any measure of respectability, if she is to continue to be accepted in society beyond those of a servant in this society. Not that servants are by any means bad society, but in this society, it was considered a quite egregious downstep. Then she would have to marry Wickham, or else she would be. It's like scarlet letter in she'd have a scarlet letter emblazoned on her chest, only it would be gossip, and every other man would view her as a lost cause, and it's sort of that now or never moment, which is sad for Lydia. But Mr. Bennet was right. It is his fault. He indulged the girl. She's 16 and she was not taken care of. She was not guided. She was not given any sense or lessons or anything. And Mr. Bennet is right in feeling that blame. But before I let you go, really quickly, I am going to figure out how to put a poll on my Twitter. It's at illuminani.com. at Illuminani on Twitter. And you can go there and vote. I will give you a few choices of what we're going to read next, because we're going to get done with this book probably in the next 2 sessions or so. I think we only have 2, maybe 3 more sessions out of this. So I have a couple of choices. I will definitely add Percy Jackson on there. And you guys can vote for what you want to read next. So check out my Twitter. As soon as I figure out how to put a poll up there, I will. All right, my beauties. Mwah! I love you all. Have a beautiful and relaxing day whenever you watch this. And I will see you next time I see you. Toodles.